Welcome back. So in this part and in the following part, we shall be looking onto the output and pricing decisions that are taken by a monopoly firm. A monopoly firm's price setting strategy is quite different from a perfectly competitive market, and the major difference between these two is that a monopoly sets its own price. So as a price setter, a monopoly firm can either decide to sell a larger quantity by offering a lower price for its product, or it can also choose to sell a smaller quantity but charging a high price for that same product. So these two situations give rise to two different price setting strategies that are taken by a monopoly firm. The first one is the price discrimination policy, and the second one is a single price strategy. According to the price discrimination policy, a firm sells its product at a different price to different customers. So, although all the customers are buying exactly the same goods or service, but they are charged differently. So, a classic example of price discrimination can be seen in the airline industry. So, consumers buying airline tickets several months in advance typically pay less than the consumers who are purchasing the airline tickets at the very last moment. And since they are buying it at the last moment, they have to pay a high price for the same tickets that were previously sold at a cheaper rate to customers. Also, the airlines charge more when the customers demand an aisle or a seat with a larger leg space. Another example of price discrimination can be seen in the telecom industries. For example, Grameenphone has different scheme for its different customers. So, those customers who are categorized as GP Gold Stars enjoy better call rates than those who are categorized as silver or non-categorized customers. So here, Grameenphone is selling exactly the same product or service, but it is charging its customers differently. So this practice is known as the price discrimination policy, and by so doing, the monopolists take advantage of the situation where they can charge the customers at a higher price, but also charge some other customers at a lower price, and finally making a profit out of this price discrimination. As opposed to the price discrimination policy, a single price monopoly charges exactly the same price to all of its customers, and thus it doesn't discriminate across its customers in terms of their age, gender, local loyalty program, or any other categories. So a classic example of single price monopoly can be the Apple product. So Apple is still a monopoly in its own market because Apple products doesn't have any close substitutes to date, and for which they are successfully engaged in business with a high profit share in the market. Apple products like iPhone, iPad, MacBook, etc. are sold at a single price to all of its customers regardless of the place where they buy the iPhone from. So for example, the current market price of an iPhone 12 is 699 US dollar, and a customer who buys an iPhone 12 will be charged exactly 699 US dollar for that same phone. Same thing goes for iPad or MacBook Pros, etc. So as opposed to the discrimination policy, here the customers are charged exactly the same price for providing exactly the same type of product. Since a single price monopoly charges exactly the same price to all of its customers, the price it charges should be such that it maximizes a monopoly's profit. So now we shall look at the profit maximizing condition of a single price monopoly by looking at its output and pricing decisions. Since in monopoly there is only one firm in the economy, so that one firm will then represent the entire market. So in monopoly, the firm's demand curve is exactly the same as the market demand curve because there is no other firm other than the monopoly in the economy. And like any other demand curve, the slope of the demand curve would be downward sloping, which will depict a negative relation between price and quantities sold. So to understand the output decision of a monopoly, first we need to understand the relation between the price and the marginal revenue that is generated by a monopoly producer. Now we shall try to understand the relation between price and the marginal revenue by looking at an example that is provided in your textbook, Parkin, Polwin and Matthews. So the figure is 13.2 from this textbook. Now the example is of that of a haircut salon that is a monopoly in the sense that there is no other salon within the 15-kilometer radius from where this salon exists. So people in the surrounding locality doesn't have any other option than going to the salon for a haircut. Now the first column represents the price that the salon charges to its customers, and as you can see, comparing the price and the quantity, as soon as the price starts decreasing, the quantity starts increasing, and when the price goes down further, the quantity starts rising. So this is in accordance with the law of demand, which states lower is the price, higher is the quantity demanded. The third column represents the total revenue that is generated by this salon, and that is the product of price and quantity sold. So for example, for the first unit sold, the total revenue would be 18. Any price that is 20 or above doesn't generate any kind of haircut because that is sufficiently in huge amount of money for an haircut to spend on. Now, as you can see on this fourth column, marginal revenues are also depicted. Now, the marginal revenue is the extra revenue that is generated by selling an extra unit. And as the salon moves from 0 to 1 quantity, it generates $18 revenue. And this $18 would be an extra revenue comparing to the situation where it wasn't selling anything. Now, as the salon keeps on selling more haircuts, you will see that the total revenue rises, and the change in total revenue from one unit to the other is then measured by the marginal revenue. And as you can see from this column that as the salon produces more haircuts, although their total revenue rises, but the marginal revenue false, which means that for an additional unit, the extra revenue that is generated by the salon will be decreasing. And that is why the marginal revenue curve for this or any kind of monopoly firm will lie underneath the demand curve, because at any given price, the marginal revenue would be lower than the total revenue. So as you can see, for example, when the price is 16, in that case, the total revenue is 32 and the marginal revenue is 10. So at a price which is $16, the total marginal revenue is 10, and when the price is $14, the marginal revenue is even below that, which is $6. So for each of these prices, the marginal revenue would be lower, and that is why if we draw the marginal revenue curve for a monopoly firm, it will always lie below the demand curve that the firm faces. So you might be wondering why the marginal revenue should always be less than the price, because the monopoly firm generates profit, right? As it is producing and selling more, it generates more profit. Then why would the marginal revenue be less than its price? The reason is when the price is lower, there are two opposing factors that affect the total revenue. The first one is the low price will incur a revenue loss, because as you can see that When price is decreased, this figure of total revenue will also reduce. On the other hand, when price is reduced, according to the law of demand, the quantity will rise. So as a result, there would be a revenue gain. So when there is a decrease in price, then there are two opposing factors that acts together. The first one is a revenue loss due to the reduction in the price, and a revenue gain due to a increase in quantity, which means the entire revenue generation for a monopoly firm will then depend on the responsiveness of price on demand. So if the demand is very much responsive to the price reduction, in that case the total revenue will be rising. And if the quantity is not that much responsive to the price reduction, in that case there would be a reduction in the total revenue as well. So in order to understand the upcoming topic, then I would like to bring you all back to chapter 5 when we discuss the elasticity and its applications. So if you have forgotten the topic already, then I would ask you to pause this video for a while and go back to brush your study on elasticity. So now we shall try to establish the relation between marginal revenue and elasticity. So if the demand of the monopoly's good is elastic, then a fall in the price will increase the total revenue because the fall in price would be lower than the increase in quantity. So that means the total revenue would be rising despite a reduction in the price, which will also mean that marginal revenue will be positive because the change would be higher. On the other hand, if the demand is inelastic, which means a reduction in the price brings about a smaller increase in quantity demanded, in that case, the total revenue would be falling because then the impact of a lower price would be stronger than that of the increase in quantity, and the total revenue in that case would be decreasing. And since the total revenue decreases, which means the change in revenue or the marginal revenue in that case will be negative. And lastly, if the demand is in unit elastic or unitary, which means the reduction in price brings about this same amount of increase in quantity, in that case the total revenue will not be changing because on one hand the price will fall, on the other hand the quantity will rise. If these two are equal, in that case the product of these two, which is the total revenue, will remain unchanged. So as a result of which the total revenue will not change, and the change in revenue, which is the marginal revenue, will also be zero. Now we shall look at the graphical representation of what I have discussed in the previous slide. So here you can see that there are two graphs. The first one depicts the relation between the price and the marginal revenue of a monopoly firm, and the second one represents the total revenue that is generated by this firm. Now, if you remember from the elasticity chapter that the elasticity varies across the demand curve, and at different point along the demand curve elasticity varies. The top part of the demand curve is usually more elastic than the bottom part of it, and the top part is thus considered as elastic. The middle part, or exactly the midpoint of the demand curve, is considered as unit elastic, and the end part, or the below part after the unit elasticity zone, is considered to be inelastic. Here in this graph, the price and the marginal revenue are depicted on the y-axis, and the quantities are depicted on the x-axis. So here you can see that when the price starts falling, the quantity demanded rises. So the monopoly firm reduces its price to increase its profit through increased quantity. Now, as long as it operates along its elastic zone, we can see that the marginal revenue curve is positive, which means the marginal revenue is positive because the marginal revenue curve falls above the positive axis. Now, looking at the total revenue curve, we shall see that in this particular case, when the monopoly farm is producing at the elastic zone, the total revenue is also increasing. As a result, the farm is generating profit by producing and selling more. However, after that point, if the monopoly farm, or here in our example the salon, increases its number of haircuts, in that case the margin revenue starts falling, because in this particular case the salon will be operating at its inelastic zone, and a reduction in price will not bring larger increase in quantity, rather the quantity increase would be sufficiently small. As a result, the additional revenue generated through additional quantity would be negative. And this is also depicted here through the total revenue curve, because you see after this quantity, after the profit, after if the firm sells more than 5 haircuts, in that case the total revenue starts falling. So which means that here the total revenue starts increasing when the monopoly farm is producing at elastic zone, but when it goes beyond its elastic zone and enters into inelastic zone, then total revenue falls along with the marginal revenue and the total profit. Now, the profit maximization would occur at this quantity, which is 5, which is exactly at the unit elastic zone. So if you ask what, or when the firm is producing more haircuts in order to make more profit, how far should it go? The answer is it will go up until the point where its total revenue is maximized. So here in this parabola, the total revenue is maximized at this particular point, which is where the number of haircuts sold by the salon is 5 and the marginal revenue is 0. So there is no scope for the firm to generate more profit by producing more, because if it does so, in that case it will incur a negative marginal revenue. So which implies that in order to maximize profit, since the monopoly firm has the authority of setting its price and quantity, it will never go beyond the elastic zone, or in other words, it will always produce within the elastic zone. And if it did so, if it were to produce at its inelastic zone, in that case it could still generate profit by charging a higher price. However, since the price and the margin revenue is negative here, this option will not be available. So in order to thus maximize profit, a monopoly firm thus will always produce at its elastic zone and try to maximize its total revenue up until the point where marginal revenue is 0.